Chapter 7, Making a Living, Part 2. The number of people who can be sustained by the resources of the environment in which they live is considered the carrying capacity. Communities need to keep their population within the limits of this carrying capacity, and it varies by subsistence techniques, labor, and technology. Next, we'll discuss how to understand subsistence and these various topics: settlement patterns, population, work in the division of labor, and the social relations. First, subsistence and settlement patterns. The way people distribute themselves in their environment, including where they locate their dwellings, how they group the dwellings into settlements, and how permanent or temporary these settlements are, makes up these subsistence and settlement patterns. Foragers, for example, use small settlements, and they're usually more mobile and they move to secure their resources. Pastoralists relocate throughout the year, and their size varies. Horticulturalists are usually living within small villages, and agriculturalists are large permanent towns or cities. The number of people living in a community depends on the resources available and strategies used to extract them. Variations in community size depend on scarcity or abundance of resources. In foraging societies, most work is assigned according to gender. It's not rigid, however, men and women's roles sometimes overlap. In general, men hunt and fish, women gather. In farming societies, heavy work is assigned to men. Few other rigid rules exist across culturally with regard to gender and the division of labor. Age is also a factor in allocating work. Young children may help by gathering wild plants in foraging societies, and in farming societies, they plant and weed and harvest crops. The modes of subsistence will affect interpersonal and intergroup relations. The type of subsistence patterns tends to lead to greater or lesser equality. Exchange patterns include reciprocity and redistribution. Reciprocity is a principle of mutual gift-giving and material support, while redistribution is the gathering together and then reallocating of the food and resources to ensure everyone's survival. Leveling mechanisms are cultural practices designed to equalize access to food, resources, and social prestige in a community. It's designed to prevent an individual from amassing greater wealth and or prestige than other people. Foraging as a subsistence pattern. Foraging was humanity's only subsistence strategy for many millennia until about 10,000 years ago. Foraging depends on nature to supply them with the resources. Over time, foraging societies have been transformed into food producers. Most foragers were nomads. Foragers survived the longest in environments that were unfit for other subsistence strategies. Nomads are people who do not have permanent homes but travel to sources of food as the food becomes seasonally available. Had to be familiar with the environment and know life cycles in plants and animals. Knowledge of the environment is very important. To successfully exploit resources, foragers need intimate knowledge of their environment, familiarity with the life cycle of plants and animals, knowledge of seasonal availability of resources, and knowledge of where and how to find water. The optimal foraging theory is that it involves the application of animal studies and decision theory to human foraging. It's used to explain why labor is expended in certain pursuits but not in others. It may reduce human behavior to biological processes and ignore the intervention of culture. Here we have some observations that unveil a misconception that foraging requires constant labor in the pursuit of food. We look at the Yuanzi's work week. In terms of foraging, there's some population factors. There's small populations. The strategies are to curb the population, like abstinence, extended nursing, contraceptive, plants, and other natural substances. Many societies also permitted infanticide. You did not want to control fertility completely, but had to keep the numbers low. Social and cultural factors not tied to the land or location. There's little property and there's much communal sharing. So the needs of others are just as important as their own needs. Land, labor, and production in foraging the societies is open access to all members of the group, family, or large kin groups. For example, watering holes. There's open access because everyone has a right to water, a necessity to survive. In pastoralism, it centers on herding and the care of domesticated animals. It's a combined subsistence strategies, rarely if ever self-contained. The combination of herding and foraging, farming, and other traded food. People's economy, settlement patterns, and social systems are adapted to large-scale herding. The ownership and control of food source, um, the economy adapted farming, wage work, or trade as a means of making a living. Population varied depending on size of grazing lands and herds. The division of labor varied, but not egalitarian. The social system is that it valued reciprocity and expressed generosity as a social norm. That is sharing. A very nomadic pastoralism or transhumanism, which is the practice among pastoralists of moving to new pasture land on a seasonal basis. Horticulture, the impact of sedentism and surpluses, um, agriculture of large-scale farming with draft animals, and the small-scale farming um, using sticks, hoes, and handheld tools. In terms of surplus, food and other goods that are produced at a greater level than that needed for survival. So they produced food produced by the horticulturalists sustain themselves in years of drought, crop failure, or flooding. Sedentary communities, their settlement patterns involve long-term permanent settlements, living in one place, trying to produce enough to surplus to sustain themselves for 1 to 2 years of bad times. They developed methods for preserving this surplus produce, and the need was to control population size due to limited surplus resources. There's also slash and burn cultivation, also called swidden, and this is a farming technique for preparing new fields by cutting down trees and bushes and then burning them to clear the land and enrich the soil with nutrients. In horticultural societies, men typically do the heavy work, like clearing the forests and woodlands to make new fields. In some societies, men continue as the primary workers. For example, the Yanomamo in Brazil and Venezuela. In other societies, women are the farmers, the Javara of Peru, for example. And in some societies, both men and women do farm work, growing the same or different crops. For example, the West African societies. Sedentary communities are settlement pattern involving that long-term permanent settlements trying to produce enough of that surplus to sustain themselves for 1 to 2 years of bad times. Surplus produced by horticulturalists to sustain themselves in years of drought, crop failure. And here we have the definition of swidden cultivation and gender allocation of work. Agriculture is as a subsistence agriculture originated in the Middle Ages in the Middle East about 12,000 years ago. Population increase, decline in health, and two characteristics of agricultural societies: permanent settlements and intensive investments in labor and technology. Here we had the use of draft animals, possibly irrigation systems, and extensive labor and land. The key here is owning the land, more stable communities, and more accumulation of goods. As I already mentioned, uh, this originated in the Middle East about 12,000 years ago. Population increase, decline in health, um, more permanent settlements, and intensive investment in labor and technology. And here we have the consequences of food production. People were able to plant, harvest, preserve, and store more food. And the increase in surplus material culture resulted in an increase in population, and then an increase in accumulation of the use of grains to feed babies and young children, increase in fertility, therefore an increase in population, the decline in lactation, then there was an increase in population, increase in food production, pressure on the dependence on intensive agriculture in urban centers, sedentary populations, and crowding into the dependence of grains, malnutrition, vulnerability to drought, famine, where large sedentary or urban populations of disease saw a decline in health standards and rapid spread. So as we have intensive agriculture, we see the application of technology and intensive labor to farming. New inventions, technological advances have contributed to a tremendous growth in agricultural productivity. For example, the plow and irrigation and draft animals. Consequences are the mechanization of labor. In the US, less than 30% of the population works in agriculture. There's a reduced amount of land used and a limited number of crops. Societies are involved in a dynamic relationship with the environment with other societies and are subject to change from both internal and external processes. Now, this chapter, having just finished a discussion of subsistence strategies, focuses on analyzing economic systems involving issues of production, distribution, consumption, and the exchange of goods. Societies organize subsistence strategies to use land and resources efficiently. People need to agree so everyone has the minimum to share in order to survive. And so exploiting resources through technology is where people need to really agree on things. Anthropologists understand economies holistically, looking at land resource use and labor and how these are interrelated. The organization of works takes into account age, gender, and skill. And goods and services form the production where rarely do people consume all that they produce. So there's a distribution with others, and consumption is the use of that subsistence resources and are also affected by cultural norms. Then we have the exchange of products for other goods and services. There are different modes of subsistence that generally are correlated with different principles on which economic systems are organized. For instance, the economics of agriculture, where there is larger populations, reliable food sources supported by population growth and permanent settlements. So the shift to agriculture led to sedentism, and there's intensive labor and technology, where farming is required, more sustained work, and new tools and technologies for planting, harvesting, and storage. Land and resources become possessions, creating new concepts of property and wealth. And as communities grew, leadership and organized systems of control emerged to manage resources and resolve conflicts. Specialists or agricultural surpluses freed some from food production, allowing them to become artisans, traders, or administrators. Intensive agriculture is the use of tools, animals, irrigation, and machines to boost productivity, but often reduces crop diversity. Industrialized agriculture is where farms become highly mechanized. Governments play a major role through subsidies, regulations, and agricultural policies. Farmers compete in national and global markets, pushing for high yield and low costs. Farms focus on a single crop or product. Overproduction can lower prices and create an economic instability. And then interdependence, is where farms depend on one another to operate efficiently, depend on the, depending on the equipment, manufacturing, fertilizer production, and transportation. So this connects local farms to a global system, making them more efficient but also vulnerable to market and environmental pressures. More farm more in analyzing the economic systems, we're really moving from simple shared resources to complex systems where ownership, specialization, and hierarchy define the economic relationships. And this is from Max Weber, a theorist on the economy. Allocating land and resources, every society must decide how land, water, and materials um, are distributed and used. Permanent ownership is where private property and long-term ownership influences wealth and power. They produced goods enough for survival, but also to create surplus for trade, storage, and redistribution. Organizing labor means work is divided, reflecting cultural norms and social organization. Uh, Depends on age and gender and specialists and social status. As production grows, artisans, traders, and administrators emerge, and higher social status is tied to their roles and the control of resources. Distributing and exchanging products and services is how goods and services move through societies. So this redistributive networks through central authority or community leaders. Markets and trade, where individuals and groups exchange products directly for that mutual benefit. Reciprocity is general, it's balanced, negative, and then there's the barter system. In generalized reciprocity, there is the exchange of goods and services without keeping track of the exact value. The expectation is that their value will balance over time. In balanced reciprocity, the exchange of goods and services are of a specified value and at a specific time and place. With negative reciprocity, the exchange of goods and services is in which each party seeks to benefit at the expense of the other. And in the barter situation or the barter reciprocity, trading of products is where one person gives a type of product in exchange for another type of product. Next, we have redistribution. Redistrib- Redistributive networks are economic systems in which an organizer amasses food and other goods, then distributes to the community members or guests at gatherings. For example, the Pacific Northwest has potlatch. There's a case study on page 192 in your text, and it's a picture here of what a potlatch looks like. Trade is a system of exchange in which goods are exchanged for other goods or money in the form of either barter or a market exchange. In market economies and capitalism, the economic system is the system in which products are traded between buyers and sellers with a commodity. In capitalism, workers do not control the means of production. Workers access the means of production via their wages, and workers produce surplus value. Money serves as the medium of exchange in market economies and capitalism, allowing goods and services to be traded efficiently without direct barter. In, in this economic system, capitalism, the system is based on money and markets and an ideology based on the private and corporate ownership of the means of production and distribution. The economic mode of production is an amass of wealth in the form of money, where the goal is to gain control over the means of production and use this control to accumulate more wealth. Capital refers to the land, money, and physical resources, like factories, that provide the foundation and materials necessary for production and economic growth. You have land, money, factories that support and supply materials needed for production. As mentioned before, in a market economy, an economic system is where products are traded in impersonal exchanges between buyers and sellers using all-purpose currency. Commodities are products that can be sold or traded in return for money or other products. Next, we have the impacts of colonial expansion, industrialism, and globalization, which transformed economies worldwide by creating systems based on labor exploitation, including slavery and taxation. Industrial economies, these forces fueled industrial production and manufacturing growth, but it also deepened social inequality and promoted consumerism as global markets expanded. Colonialism is when powerful nations establish control over distant territories, as we discussed in a previous chapter. So the policies in which countries establish colonies in distant places. They exploit their resources and labor for economic gain, and these powers establish settlements of their own citizens abroad, creating lasting political, economic, and cultural hierarchies that shaped global inequality. And this led to the spread of capitalism and market-based economies, relying on mass production of commodities. There was this demand for mass-produced goods that encouraged new technologies and the development of the factory system, a hallmark of industrialization, where you have the use of machines to produce products and food. Industrial agriculture is characterized by 6 general features: increased use of complex technology and the replacement of human labor, increased role of state agencies in farm production policies, the tendency toward competition among producers, specialization of crop production, the overproduction of farm products, and the increased interdependence between farm units and corporations that control machinery, sales, processing, and transport. The consequence is the creating efficiency, but also economic environmental vulnerability, for example, deforestation. And here we have the percent of population involved in three economic sectors in 2007: the agriculture industry, and services. Percent of the gross domestic product. The developed economies are small agricultural sectors and the large service sectors. Countries with larger agricultural share of the gross domestic product are Liberia and Rwanda. They have higher poverty rates, while stronger industrial and service sectors like Belgium and Poland show lower poverty levels. So the shift from agriculture toward industry and services, income rises and poverty declines. Comparing subsistence strategies, we have foragers who rely on hunting and gathering to maintain diverse diet and mobile lifestyle, small cooperative communities contributing to goal overall health. This is sort of a summation of everything. Nomadism in small communities, related health benefits. Pastoralists, they depend on herding domesticated animals with ownership of livestock serving as the key source of wealth, status and social prestige within their communities.